Good morning. And kalimera. In my own life, my favorite country to visit, and it's not even close, is Italy. I've been 4 times in my life. I went twice with my family when I was growing up, and I've been twice with my wife. And the most recent time that we went, one time we went for our honeymoon, and another time a couple of years later after I'd been ordained to the priesthood. And most recently, I guess it would be 2011 was the last time that we went. One of the cities that we went to was to Florence. And Florence, of course, is a city that is worldwide famous for a lot of different things, but mostly for the religious art that they have there. And we know from history that a lot of the famous Renaissance paintings and statues and so forth that were produced in Western Europe were often produced for the churches. And it was no exception in the city of Florence, which was regaled with many religious figures and figures from the Old Testament and New Testament and so forth. And one of the statues that we saw while we were there was Michelangelo's David. Michelangelo was a very famous artist, of course, as we know from our history books and art classes and so forth, who was commissioned to do, actually, I read about this last week, he was commissioned to do a series of 12 Old Testament figures for the main cathedral in Florence. I don't know how many he ended up finishing, but his statue of David took 3 years. And today it is in a very famous museum, and they've made like a replica in the original spot outside of the cathedral where it was originally intended. There's many reasons that Michelangelo's David is a very famous sculpture and a masterpiece of religious art. And the story goes, according to maybe legend at this point, when Michelangelo finished his David, and the people marveled at how beautiful the statue was, they said, "How on earth did you come up with this? How did you figure out how to create such an incredible statue?" Michelangelo's response was, he says, "The statue was already there. When I saw the block of stone, the statue was already there. All I did was clear away the extra pieces." The statue was already in the block of stone, Michelangelo said. "I just cleaned away the extra pieces." In Michelangelo's perspective, I don't know how many of us could do this, but he looked at a block of stone and saw that. Amazing. I don't know how many of us could look at a block of concrete or marble or whatever it is and say, I'm going to make some masterpiece of the human figure or some masterpiece of a figure of the Bible. But it was all about the perception of the artist who saw what was to come out of the statue. He did not see simply a block of stone. He saw the potential for something beautiful. And in his perspective, that beauty came out. I don't know how many of us perceive these kinds of things in our own life, but perception is a huge part of life, is it not? How we perceive things around us is incredibly important, and the difference in a lot of ways between a happy life and a miserable life. Most importantly of all, my brothers and sisters, how do we perceive ourselves? Do we look at ourselves as a beauty of a work of art? Or do we find ourselves comparing ourselves to the people around us and saying, well, I'm not this, I am not this, I am not as wealthy perhaps as this family down the street, or maybe my car is not this, or maybe this person looks nicer than I do, or their clothes, or their whatever, or for those of us perhaps who are in school still, some of the young brothers and sisters today, do we look at quote-unquote cool kids at school and say, man, I gotta be like that kid. What am I doing? How do we perceive ourselves? Do we perceive ourselves as beautiful works of art in the way that God does? Or do we perceive ourselves as something far less than that? Not realizing the beauty that is within us. The perception of human beings, not just of ourselves, but especially of ourselves, is something that has existed as long as human beings have existed, of course. And the people of Jesus' time, and even before that, at least before the incarnation, shall we say, because Jesus is eternal, of course, also had these kinds of questions about my own perception of myself. What does God think of me? What do others think of me? And how much importance do we place on those things? I'm going to warn everybody today, we're going to get a little more theological than normal, so bear with me, please, okay? If it goes over your head, just throw your life preserver back to John 3:16 and we'll pick you up next week. But in any case, today's feast day, I Papandi, the presentation of the Lord, or literally the meeting of the Lord in the temple. Jesus' 40-day blessing, and we have this service today, this feast day today, because it's 40 days after December 25th. Jesus coming into the temple, being brought to the temple by the Virgin Mary and the righteous Joseph, his father, is of course something that we do today. We bring babies to be churched on their 40-day blessing. But in Jesus' time, it was an observance of the law. That's why we heard in the reading today, not only did they have to bring the baby, they had to bring pigeons or turtle doves. Something that might look unusual to us, but this was prescribed in the Mosaic law. So in other words, what the people of God believed in the Old Testament was a very specific set of instructions on how to live. And they said, God told Moses to tell the people, don't touch this, stay away from this food, that food. If you wrong a person in this way, if you sin in this way, you are to make retribution by paying them back 4 times, or doing this, or showing yourself to the priest, or washing in the temple, all of these things. The law is what it was called, the Mosaic law. And we hear this word a lot, especially in these kinds of readings from the Bible. The law was not the end goal in and of itself, of course. St. Paul likens this to us being like infants and therefore having a guardian, a custodian, if you will. Someone to take care of us in our infancy. And very specific instructions on what to do. By the time the New Testament comes around, and by the time Jesus is sitting at the Last Supper with his disciples, he does not call them infants anymore. He calls them friends. There is now a new law, according to Jesus, a way of connecting people with God. The law was the beginning, and by Jesus being brought to the temple, they were observing the law and saying to the people, no, this is important. But there was potential for more. We were not called to stay here. We were called to be with Jesus Christ, with God himself. So we went from the law to Jesus Christ and into the miracle stories that we hear to this day with the saints and with the life of the church. The potential was there. The potential in the baby also is there. To go from this to something else, to something more than that. We are called not simply to just stay here. We are called to union with God. There is a potential that is within each of us according to the words of Christ. We may see ourselves as a blank canvas, like a stone, but God sees potential for something far more than that, to be with him in this beautiful way. Where someone might see something very plain and ordinary, God sees in every single one of us a beautiful work of art, a masterpiece of the highest quality and of the highest order. That is what Paul means when he says, that is when, that it is what we heard in the epistle reading today. The inferior is blessed by the superior. There is a transition that is happening. The inferior to the superior. St. Peter talks about this kind of potential that is within each of us. He talks about, and the church talks about in a lot of ways, the human being is meant for more. It is meant to become Christ-like. We are meant to become in union with Christ. St. Peter calls this partakers of the divine nature. There is something more than this. There's a potential there to reach something higher than that with Christ. No matter how we perceive ourselves, brothers and sisters, to bring it back to the original lesson, no matter what we may think we are or we are not, no matter what we think we lack, no matter how we think we measure up with someone else, quote unquote, that is not how God views us. God views us, no matter who we are, as something absolutely beautiful and a masterpiece. He is the greatest artist. And he sees us and what we can be what we can become, what potential we can realize as we go forward in our life. We may think we have jagged pieces to ourselves. We may think of ourselves as an uninteresting block of stone. But God sees what is beneath that and the potential for more. When God tells Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you and consecrated you before all nations. Before I formed you, I formed you. He forms us and continues to form us. And if we may go even a little bit more theological, bear with me, please. What is heaven? If not continuing that potential growth all the way into something beautiful and holy and divine. That is what we are called for. That is how God sees us. And that is the work of art that each and every one of us is. No matter what we hear from people around us, no matter how we may seem to the rest of the world or to ourselves, the only perception that matters is God's. And He is the one who says, I saw and I see you, what you can become. May we always remember this and our inherent value and how special we are in God's eyes every day of our lives. Amen. God bless you.